Hi, everyone. Welcome to Ritual of Wild. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Xenia Viray. I came across her work on Instagram and I just really love everything that she creates. Xenia, I just want to let you know that your work, I find the creative aspect of it so very appealing. And every time I read something that you've put out in the world, I feel like it just feels like a really warm hug that my soul welcomes. It feels familiar, yet my ego's kind of like, ooh, that really pushes me up against an edge. But deep down, I just feel this deep resonance. So I want to welcome you to Ritual of Wild. And I always give a bit of context as to how I come across my guests. So I'm really grateful that you're here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and thank you for engaging with my work.
I would love to know more about that because I feel like there was somewhere I read in, I think it was in one of your About You sections, but it was something along the lines, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but it was like you woke up one day and you decided you wanted to be your whole human self and just really explore what that path looked like. And these days, I find that really hard to do, really hard to be, really scary and terrifying, and yet a lot of liberation in choosing a path like that. So I would love to know for you how myths of creation, which is what Xenia is known on as Instagram, how that came about for your life, like what turned you toward that path.
Well, it's a really kind of long and winding story. And for people who know human design, I'm a manifesting generator. So that is kind of the way manifesting generators create very non-linearly. And Myths of Creation actually began as a brick and mortar shop. And in 20, I want to say 14 or so, I kept being pushed by the universe to work in fashion or be a store owner. And I never studied anything in fashion. I went to school for writing, multidisciplinary writing, which is much closer to what I do now. But every job that I got by accident, by the way, was pushing me into working in the fashion world. And I opened this shop because I wanted to create a space in my neighborhood where I felt like the price points were more accessible and where I could express my instinct for fashion, which was my primary way of expressing myself since I was a little kid. And after I ran that shop for a couple of years, I had this reading with a psychic named Hank. Actually, he was reading all these artists who were part of a group show where everyone had to get a reading with a medium and then make art about the reading. And a friend of mine went and had such a profound experience that as soon as I heard about him, I immediately decided to go see him. And so after just that single reading, I felt completely different because no one had ever really talked to me about anything esoteric, mystical, or spiritual. I come from a deeply Catholic family and was very much sort of intellectual and artistic living in New York City since I turned 18 or 19, but never really delved into anything about psychic work or mysticism. So my business, because it was always reflecting me, started to have in-house resident monthly astrology reader. Sometimes we'd have tarot readers. Sometimes we'd have workshops about mysticism.
Cool.
And over time, I realized that what I really loved wasn't creating the shop, it was creating experiences and connecting to people. But my imagination couldn't picture anything anywhere close to what I'm doing now. So it showed me the closest access point to creating spaces and experiences for recreating reality in the way that feels more welcoming to all of who I am and to all of who other people are.
Wow, that is like such a powerful thing to trust, especially naming that you came from a Catholic background, as did I. I can relate with that. But I remember growing up and none of that was really welcome. In fact, we were kind of steered away from anything to do with readings or astrology. So it's really cool that you trusted that within yourself and created that experience, because that is what I wanted to say at the start, which is every time I read one of your posts, it feels like an experience. Anyone that comes across Xenia's page knows that the posts are animated and they're colorful. Some of them are colorful and some of them are not. But even when they're like a bit monochrome, they still have energy behind them. I don't know how else to explain it other than I can feel a charge behind them, but it's a nice charge. It feels like there's reciprocity there.
Thank you for sort of sharing your experience around that, the visual aspect of the work, because, I am an Aries, and what's really interesting about that is I operate largely on instinct. And most of the work I do, I'm untrained. I'm trained in human design, astrology. I went to schools for writing, but I was never trained in entrepreneurship outside the workshops that I, piecemealed together. And I was never trained in visuals or any kind of graphics or anything. I mean, I wasn't trained in fashion either. And there's a real benefit to being untrained, which is that you have no idea what the rules are or what people will expect. And so you kind of approach your creation process like a child. You don't really think about it because you don't really even know what you're supposed to be thinking about. You're just kind of gluing things together that feel right or look good to you. And so I'm really proud of my universe of visuals I've created, because I know there's tons of typos. There's so many things that I get wrong, but there's a lot of satisfaction in knowing that it's coming from I created a universe in which I had no choice but to resource things from within myself, because I don't really know how else to do it. And so I always hope that creates a kind of new or curious or almost like strange feeling when people come across this, like this feels or looks a little bit different. So I'm glad it sort of lands with you in some way.
It really does. And I really want to tease out what you just said about creating from the universe within yourself. It sounds like you were on a path in which all of this was being presented to you. You opened your shop, but you didn't really have that background in mysticism to begin with. So, how would you navigate that as someone like myself who gets downloads all the time? And I like to be in the practice of being an open channel, and that is, I feel like, one of my biggest edges, and something I find in common when I'm speaking with other people that get pushed up against this edge is it sounds like you were able to trust that childlike self and really go for it. And I love that. But how do you trust yourself? How do you, when your heart is speaking with you and it feels like fire and it feels really inspirational, how do you lean into that versus, what everyone else might be doing? What if this lands in a way that doesn't make sense and it's too strange and I get canceled, things like that? With media right now, there's a lot of people speaking to what you speak to, but no one is speaking it the way you do, speaks to it in the way you do, the way you present this beautiful, it feels like a love parcel. And I can receive it as such because just getting to know you and through your work. But what would you tell someone? Like, how do you trust yourself when it comes to like, oh gosh, I could feel it's taking up so much space in my body, but my mind's telling me it's too weird or too scary to what's the word? But to go after.
I mean, I think there were a lot of scary edges for me when I was creating my own business. I would have to say that everything in our education, at least the education I had in a sort of American public school, teaches you that if you learn a structure, you're always going to get positive feedback, or there's always going to be a reflection or response of where you are on a map, whether it's grades or getting a promotion. And so our nervous system learns this track of following directions and knowing where we're going and then getting the positive feedback. Like when you get to this marker, this milestone, you'll meet this person and that means you've arrived here.
Hmm.
So our body is looking for these things. When we're in this zone of creating from the universe inside of us, you are automatically opting into a life that's not going to give you those signposts and signals in the same way. But you will receive signposts and signals. They just won't be the ones that your mind or your body are expecting. And
Right.
so when I talk to people, because I primarily work with a lot of creatives who are inventing their own unique language, creating their own unique take on life, creating their own modality, their own perspective, their own universe. That's what I specialize in working with. And I always feel like it's really easy to romanticize this idea of jumping off a cliff and ignoring our fears. But I don't actually think that everyone is wired that way. I think that's a sure way to get yourself on a far pendulum of swinging back and forth between total fear and total fearlessness and having a really hard time finding your center. So, what I first of all tell people is that what they're experiencing is completely normal. It shouldn't be any other way. Of course, you're going to experience that. I actually usually tell people that if they're bumping against a feeling like that, it usually means that they're on the right track because it means that they left the known. So, that feeling of, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing, that's a good thing. If you're pioneering something truly unique or original, you should feel and you will feel like you don't know what you're doing. That is literally the course you're on. You're doing something that you don't know how to do. And you build the trust by walking one step at a time instead of looking 10 steps ahead and saying to yourself, if I don't get to this place, then I failed. And people tend to think that way. So, my advice is to enjoy the process instead of enjoy the product. Stop looking for an outcome and look at yourself. Are you having fun? I think a lot about children, and when a child is learning to walk, it's pretty scary to watch them. There's a lot of ways they can hurt themselves, and it's really easy to project your fear onto them, especially if you were raised by someone who's really scared. Well, your creativity is very similar. If you keep telling it, oh, be careful, watch here, watch there. If you fall down, you're not going to be okay. It's going to be scared to make a move. Whereas if you kind of provide a soft space for it, where there's some risk involved, but not too much risk involved, and let it learn what it feels like to move in a direction, it'll start to know the sensations of its own unfolding and its own emergence. So trust is built by giving someone a chance to try something.
Yeah, I love that you said that. I have two little children. They're 3 and 1, and so I can definitely connect with the image of, witnessing them learn how to walk. And one thing that I found really cool about it is, yes, you're creating that like soft landing pad around for them to make mistakes or maybe try something that doesn't work, but it's really interesting when you leave them to their own. Instinctively, they start to feel for like what structure is more solid for them to hang on to, which one didn't work last time, so they stay away from it. And it just feels like a beautiful metaphor for what you're describing. And this piece you speak to about trust, like how you said, enjoy the process versus focusing so much on the product. I just think that like gave me chills because a lot of people are focused on that end game. And I was meditating the other day, and what I was receiving was, because I always ask this, like, how do I trust myself? I find a lot of what I want to create is halted by this notion of like, but can I trust the idea? And I know where it's coming from. Like, it feels very egoic. And what I was receiving is, trust. It's not something that you have to, it's like, I guess I was always looking to feel it first before I made the move. Like inspiration received, and then I'm looking for, can I trust it though? And then take action. But what I was receiving in that moment of praying on it and meditating on it is that trust is there. It comes as a result of, I don't want to use the word like trusting that intuition or trusting that inspiration, but it's like going with the feeling. It's being
Yeah.
present in the process and not so much about getting somewhere as it is with really being with something and feeling it take up space, allowing it to take up space. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That is so interesting because recently I was thinking about how what it's like to go on a date with someone, and how some people just want to be with you. Like they just want to spend the time with you, and they're not necessarily trying to like figure out, do you fit into my expectation or picture of what I'm looking for? Do you match these criteria that I have in my head around how I'll know you're the right one? Like sometimes as people, we're so vast and so gigantic, like we don't even know what we're looking for. What we might be looking for might be like way smaller than what's available in the expanse of human personalities and spirits. And I feel like creativity is similar. It's like, you want me to do something for you. Why don't you get to know me? Why don't you hang out with me? Like, I'm not going to do something for you if you're constantly trying to like extract from me, essentially. And I think that the wall that we hit is because there's this really big pattern I see, and I experience this myself, which is everyone around you, for the most part, is doing work that is probably like a different version of than what they prefer to be doing. A lot of people, have families to take care of, were raised in a way where they need to take a safer route, and or they're just designed to actually like work a normal job, and that's really in their truth. And when you opt not to do that and chase something else, you already feel the pressure that you better prove that this is going to pan out, because otherwise it feels way too entitled to not just do something that by other cultural standards, you'd be so lucky to have a normal job and a roof over your head. So there is a big battle for a lot of people in their creativity to feel a deservingness in getting to explore a life that their peers and their parents never got to. And so
Right.
they're also battling the separation from the family, the group, the community, the tribe. And so it's a really complicated path that I think requires a lot more compassion and nuance and patience than we imagine.
And there's something you said there about of what can I extract from you creation. And the way I've learned to sort of embrace my creative process now is to treat it as if it's this living, breathing entity that is, moving through me. And I love that you use the dating analogy, because I was just speaking to this with my partner, and I'm like, sometimes I feel like the hack is like our relationship, because of how much we worked to get to know each other. It wasn't like, this is what I expect, and this is what I want. Like, those things are real, and it is a reciprocal relationship that's taking place, where you have to have regard for what it's showing you. Like, in the early stages of my relationship, it wasn't always about what I wanted. Now this energy came into my life where it was like, what could we create together, essentially? And that meant creating space for them to take up space and sort of show me and guide me their way as well. And so as you're saying that, I'm just like, oh my God, yeah, that's the reminder. It's like, you can be in relationship with creativity and have grace and compassion and patience and spaciousness, and just notice how that shifts the process. And it feels like it puts me more in a seat of deep presence, instead of like, oh my gosh, what are people going to think about this thing that wants to come through? Oh my gosh, what are people going to think if I date this guy?
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like I had a client recently who wrote this amazing, beautiful book. They didn't consider themselves a writer, first time author. I read the book and I was like, I couldn't put this down. It's so good. And, we were talking about all these business plans and how to put it forward in the world. And we created like some really cool ideas. And then at the end, after like months of seeing each other, she was like, you know what? I don't even really feel any pressure for this to make any money anymore, even though that was the primary reason. I felt pressure to figure this out because I got so much out of writing this. It gave me so much already that what happens after this is a total bonus. And I really do think that people misunderstand this idea of like neutrality or divine neutrality. I think they think it's like detachment or dissociation or a lack of passion or compassion. But I think what it actually is metabolizing so much of an experience and enjoying so much of a process and being so present with yourself through a process that outcomes become sort of like secondary to anything. You're having so much fun in the process that the product or the result is just a kind of consequence of you having such a good time.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that so much. One thing I've noticed too for people, especially like even for myself, is to say yes to that which wants to come through sometimes comes with an aspect of, I want to say grief. And I use that word because when something really inspires me, it shows me everything that is not. And I just got chills as I said that. And that feels like having to recalibrate my relationship with how I experience certain parts of my world. And it's not to say it's a bad thing or a negative thing. It's just there's grief. And to make a long sort of question or statement short, I find that we as a society don't always know how to welcome grief because it would have to mean the end of something versus, caring for something or having it as proof that, there was really some aspect of yourself that this part of your life was really applicable at some point in time. And now the way I could compare this to is like, when you choose to become a mother, it's like, I'm so excited for what this means creatively and lovingly and what this means for our family system. And I'm so hyper aware now of how much my life is going to change. So when I speak to that in terms of creativity, I guess what I'm trying to say is whether it's something big or small, and obviously this sounds like a bigger scale question, how do you manage, and can you relate to that aspect of grief when it comes to creativity? How do you manage that if that is so?
I mean, um, I think grief is a really hard one for me intergenerationally. I think that I don't have to go far back in my lineage to find forms of loss that are just so heartbreaking. And I come from a lineage of people from my observation that could not really process what was happening and what they were feeling and also be able to survive and move forward. They had to function. And to that end, I feel like I relate to other people who resist grief. It's cultural, but I definitely experienced that myself. One of the things I notice in creativity is that, well, there's a couple of things. The first thing is that there's the grief of something leaving the imaginal world and being made material, and the loss of the dream or the fantasy as it hits the real world and doesn't exactly match what you thought it would be or how it would look. And for me, I know that certain people, it's going to be like a kind of far out belief, but I really, really believe this, that like certain people are not really native to this delimitation experience of being human, where there's so many aspects that are challenged. I mean, I think being human is primarily a state of learning through limitation and using limitation as a creative bumper. And I think that there's a lot of grief when we take what we think is like our baby, our idea. It's so precious. We want to protect it and we let it meet the world. And we no longer have control over so many aspects of what will happen to it as it forms itself. I think there's a lot of grief there. I've noticed that with my clients for sure. But another thing is that I think about productivity culture, how we measure success in the entrepreneurial world. And I went to a business incubator that I was super grateful for it because it was completely sponsored by the Tory Burch Foundation and a couple other financial institutions. But what we are taught success is runaway growth in all directions at all costs. There's no dying off or cutting off. And when that happens, it's not seen as like a healthy part of nature. It's seen as like a failure to the system. And we know from nature that like if you were to grow and grow and grow and never shed, that would create a deformity that's actually really inorganic. That's kind of the definition of like how cancer cells replicate. And so I feel like what you're speaking to is not just personal, that grief of change, that is like a cultural fear that we've been indoctrinated with across generations and are still being indoctrinated with now.
Yeah. And I guess for some, like even for myself, it's even hard to be aware of that because I myself have not until recently haven't been resourced with the tools to be able to name that. It's just this feeling that comes. And it's not just around creativity. I think it's just something, there's like this collective grief that we are experiencing right now. And, you know, while we're on the thread of creativity, I'm curious for you on your thoughts about when we get an inspiration that feels so big and powerful, like you've got chills, it keeps you up at night. This happens with me with my writing. Do you feel like as you birth that into the world, you materialize it from this very visceral feeling in the body to sharing it out there with the world? Do you feel like that comes from another dimension for the collective? Like it's not just about you, or is it?
I mean, it's interesting. So I'm in the middle of running this container for the second time called Create Your Cosmology. And a lot of it is about how we develop our perspectives and we develop our subjective beliefs. And so I really play in the realm of like, we're creating the reality at all times on some level because our perception and our culture and our belief system is always going to be at play. We can't really remove that from ourselves. And so the reason I'm bringing that up is because recently a mentor of mine said to me, you know, energy doesn't have a form. We have to imagine the form in a way that works for us to interact with us. So somebody's going to see an angel with wings moving through them when they're doing something creative. Somebody's going to imagine it's coming from their inner child. Somebody else is going to imagine it's just coming from their mind and their brain and their discipline. And somebody else is going to imagine that they have like a creative spirit that they work with. And I don't know what that energy is. It's probably kind of formless and depends how we want to project and interpret and receive that signal from the universe. But I think that we should feel more freedom to play with and create with what works for us. I don't know how much it matters what's really happening. I think that if you're in the experience and you are not enjoying the way energy is moving through you, then however you want to conceptualize it should be fun and helpful and freeing and hopefully empowering to you. Because something I will caution against in this world of working with our energy or our creativity as another entity is feeling like we don't have any say in the boundaries or how it's going to move through us and what it's asking of us. Because I believe it's all co-created, I question that relationship of feeling like, well, this energy came over me, so I couldn't take care of myself for 7 days because I had to feverishly create this thing. That if it's not harming or hurting you in any way, I think that however you're imagining it is the best way for your spirit to receive that relationship.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful thing to name. Is that like, you know, if an energy comes over you, it doesn't mean don't take care of yourself if it feels that visceral. And it reminds me of something that I've experienced over the last, even as a mother, over the last 4 years. And it's not linear, I forget it sometimes, but the way through which I access my divinity is to allow my whole humanity. It's actually when I'm keeping my whole self and experience in the process and not trying to like keep away the imperfections or what I think is considered flawed and not bring that to the forefront of who I am, because the truth is we're human and we do have a responsibility while we're here. And I just think it's really beautiful to ground into this experience on earth as being human. After all, our bodies is what allows our souls to be here, and also be in connection with that spiritual, soulful aspect of us.
Yeah, totally. I think that, I once heard this idea. I wish I could tell you where I heard it first, but I hear it all the time, so it's sort of hard to name. But there's this idea that being human is a great privilege of spiritual, energetic mastery that lots of beings want to incarnate as humans, but only some get to do that. And I know it doesn't feel fun all the time. And I know it doesn't feel like the easiest place to be all the time in your body, on the planet, in the here and now. But I think about what it would be like to be an undifferentiated, beam of light or something connected to God, source, spirit, whatever you want to call it, the universe. And then to experience how to maintain that loving, interconnected vibration within the human, complicated, confusing experience of limitation, forgetting, misunderstanding, constant stimulation. And I think that really our relationships with ourselves and each other offer us these constant opportunities to remember that we are connected, that we are universally coming from this same source. Even if you look at it scientifically, people believe that it's most likely we all came from the Big Bang. So it's like we're literally made of everything that the stars are made of and what each other is made of and what the plants and animals are made of. And so in that sense, I feel like what is the perfection that we imagine should be here on the planet? Like what makes us feel like those mistakes or those flaws are not supposed to be there? Like I actually, part of it is maybe because I'm impatient, but I leave my typos up on my page all the time because I'm just like, I'm a person. I wrote this morning in my sweats on my porch with my cat. I'm a human being and it's okay. Like, we're all okay.
That actually reminds me of one of your posts, and it was I think I have it here, and it was something about, I'm just going to pull it up. I've been thinking a lot about humans as gardens. What helps one bloom causes another to wither. I would love for you to speak to this. And by the way, if you've seen this post, you would see Xenia's beautiful ability to capture animation behind the words. And this is one of those prime examples of like, I'm reading this and I'm also enchanted by the art, like the way you bring the words to life through the imagery as well. So thank you for doing that through your work. I really love that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that I wrote that post after I was really being haunted by this habitual thought that I should be more adventurous, want to do more things in person, whatever, all the ways we think we're different than we should be because maybe we see our friend do something and it looks so appealing and so fun. I remembered in that moment, because a lot of the posts come from me asking a question and hearing the answer, or asking a question and then hearing a few different things in response to my own sort of human confusion. And in that particular moment, I remember realizing that we all have a different stress tolerance. And sometimes what's really exhilarating to one literally breaks someone else. And what feels safe to someone else makes somebody lose all their life force, lose all their excitement. It's just not enough. And how that simple thing, like think about your conversations with friends or clients or partners, is really difficult to negotiate in real time to maintain that connection with each other. And then remember this thing that I think is so amazing that's fulfilling me. It doesn't really mean anything to this person that I love, or they don't really need that. And it's just so easy to think that there's some better or right way you can be yourself.
Mm.
And I believe we all have feelings and thoughts like that. And it's just important to remember that even the part of us that's afraid is serving a purpose, and there's a way to honor and accept and learn from that part of us too.
Yeah, I love that. And I was thinking about this recently as well. And I remember I was eating this chocolate bar once, and it was like this eco dark chocolate. And the packaging was so beautiful. And when I opened it on the inside, it was a picture of a forest, like a rainforest. But on top of the rainforest, it said farm like a forest. And the whole purpose of it was like every part was necessary. Every part was necessary for that ecosystem to thrive. And it wasn't like this man made thing that, only some aspects were welcome or some others weren't. But that's essentially the inspiration from which they derived their chocolate. And I just thought that was such a powerful message in the bar.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Even that concept of farming versus forest. It's really interesting you bring that up because in the container I am facilitating, we talk about the word culture. And there's a part of the container, a module that's called culture is a cult. But the word culture comes from the same word as cultivate. So, cultivating land. And the root word in the back, which is Latin, it's colere, Colere, is the same root word of colonize.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I feel like it's interesting to think about this feeling that we invented farming or tilling the land, but it's like when you think about like what an ecosystem or a forest is, it's already growing food.
Yeah.
It's already farming itself. So yeah, that is such a beautiful metaphor that you brought up.
Thank you for sharing that piece about the color. And actually, in French, color means color, like the collar on a t-shirt. So I find that kind of interesting too. Um, I would love to talk about mysticism and how would you define what mysticism is? This is something I've stepped into in the last year or two, and I'm a student of somatic therapy. And so there's a huge aspect in mysticism that my teacher loves to bring to our program, and I love it so much. And I would love to hear from you how you would describe mysticism.
So I actually connect to that, the philosophy that each of us has a direct connection to the divine, that there's no intermediary necessary whatsoever. And it was only in the last 3 or 4 years that I learned about different mystical sects of Judaism, a mystical sects of Islam, mystical sects of Catholicism and Christianity. And I had no idea that all of these things existed because I was always given the more politicized version or commercialized version of these major world religions. And when you look at, for example, the I can't. Her name is. There's a Catholic nun from the 1300s, I believe, named Hildegard von Bingen, who was like this herbalist and who did beautiful art and wrote these amazing symphonies and would get these wild headaches because she was having visions all the time, but she was working within the Catholic institution. And her relationship with the divine, first of all, was very creative, right? Like she was channeling all these artworks and studies and studying the stars. And she was also somebody who was experiencing everything through her body, as
Yeah,
you were talking about the somatic connection to
right.
mysticism. And so I think what's really interesting is it's not so much the content, but the process that makes something mystical for me.
I love that. Could you share an example of how that process or that feeling is embodied to you through creativity or just through any example in your life maybe it's not just creativity, although I think everything is creativity, but how might that intersect with just a day-to-day example? Tell me about a
So,
really mystical experience.
I feel like what feels really mystical and really personal and also universal in this weird way is the way patterns speak to us in our lives, like the way certain things repeat themselves over and over and over in ways that are really, really difficult to explain. So, the best example I have for you is that when I had my brick and mortar shop, I remember this customer came in and I waitressed down the street, so I knew her from around the neighborhood. And she was like, "This used to be my friend Ida's shop." And I was like, what was this shop called before? And she said, Orange Marmalade. And Orange Marmalade is a store that I remember going to on my 22nd birthday and my friend getting me a present there. And they had a shopping bag with a little bird on it. And I tattooed that little bird, which I didn't know at the time was a robin, but was a robin, on my collarbone. And more than 10 years later, I ran my own business out of that storefront, not even realizing it was the same store and how I already had this tattoo on my body. They're sort of like, almost, it feels like timelines are bleeding through and showing you a connection by
Yeah.
just coincidences that statistically really don't make sense, or they show you the way that you are always leading yourself, even though at the time it seemed chaotic and messy, that you actually always knew where you were going.
Wow. That's so wild. It makes me think of examples in my life now where it may have been a mystical experience, but perhaps I wasn't aware of it at the time. Like one example I had is during the birth of my daughter. So there's like a team of midwives, and you don't know who you're going to get. And there's four on the team that I had, and everything was fine. It was a wild experience. But I did run into a major hiccup, and my midwives weren't there at the time by my choice. But the one that did arrive, after we debriefed everything, she told me that morning out of the blue, she felt the need to take my file and just read it front to back. And it was like in the middle of a meditation, and she never disrupts the meditation, but she just really felt pulled, like just in case. Because of that, she was the one that I got randomly, because you just page and who you get is who you get. Um, it was exactly that who needed to be there in that moment for me to be able to move through that the way I did. So her and I always kind of connect on that, and we're just always blown away by like, wow, there's just so much more to this experience than what we see.
100%. Yeah, there's so much that happens that really doesn't make logical sense. And yet it is. You have the experience. And so your
Yeah.
experience displaces your doubt because you have the experience.
So would you say one way for a person, if they were interested, to have more of those experiences, or at least be more connected with that aspect of life, would you say one avenue would be to practice stillness or presence, or what's like a basic fundamental way that someone could invite that energy into their life?
I think that's a great question because I keep returning to these really simple things. I would normally say stillness and meditation, but I feel like that's really hard for some people,
Yeah.
especially people with children. And it's just really unbelievable how what happens in 24 hours when you are. I don't have kids, but I help my sisters with their kids. So, as witness to it, I see.
Yeah.
But what I notice, even in people who have lots of time freedom, is that it's really easy for us to not pay attention. And usually that's because we're pushing into the future, or we're kind of obsessing about the past.
Right.
And I always try to notice if I'm stacking life so that it's so full that I never have to feel or process anything. And even though we get praised for that, it's really a way of running away from ourselves. And even though it feels like we're doing more, we're actually end up running in circles because it's very easy to be reactive when you have no space to process
Yes.
anything. So I think that it's much more to create tiny windows where you're taking a walk, where you're doing a chore more slowly, where you're just creating a little bit more space between the things of life that you just have to do, because there are things. And I think those micro changes allow you to receive the signs that you're given. Like sometimes I'll be writing and I'll look up and there'll be a cloud and the sun is hitting it. So there's a rainbow above my head. And I will think to myself, how often was I just like stressing or planning my day that this happened, but I just didn't look? Like, how
Right.
often does that occur? And so it's really, I think, showing the universe that you are open and receptive to what it's sending you.
Yeah. And it's so true what you said about like as parents, like so much can happen even in 1 hour, and it makes me think of like as you were speaking, it was so beautiful what you said. And what I was receiving was the word capacity kept coming and sufficiency. And it's like to circle back to what we were talking about earlier about humans being gardens, I just, for some, like as a busy mama, for example, like that capacity isn't always there. And sometimes the greatest thing I can offer in presence is to sit amid the messy ass living room and acknowledge, like, yeah, it's super messy, but being more present with the imperfection of how my living room actually looks beyond this camera right now is far more impactful than pretending it's not there and holding it together. And it makes me think of intention, like how much more impact our intention has over the environment. Like yes, obviously setting the scene is really helpful, and we can also access it, I could tell you as a busy mama, through our intention. And I was once taught by one of my teachers, Usha Anandi. She says intentions are a living prayer, and I just really love that. So yeah, I love what you said too about space and how that could be micro towards a macro, like building towards the bigger ability to be still. And it makes me think of another saying I heard where small hinges swing big doors. And it's like it is those little things do matter, and what we consider not, it's not good enough or not enough in a sense of like accessing that presence actually is like the most thing you could do right now, and that is like so perfect, like even in itself.
Yeah. You know, you're reminding me of two things. There's two things I want to say. First of all, I used to be someone who really suffered from needing to optimize everything. I would drive myself insane by thinking about the best possible permutation of how to choreograph a day. And I believe that what happens when we get attached to our ideals is we start to have this thinking of like, okay, when I feel this amount of energy and I have this amount of time and I have this particular setup, I will then do this really amazing thing instead of seeing what we can do today that is just like 1 to 2% of that vision. Because if we
Yeah.
did that every day, we would just eventually experience a huge shift without needing to put so much pressure on ourselves or need to do this crazy leap of faith. We would just change sort of the way flowers slowly turn towards the sun and then wither
Yeah.
and start again. It'd just be tiny, but really impactful. And so I wanted to say that because for years I was just waiting for these like big, sexy fantasies to be possible. And
Yeah.
one day I was like, what? I'm like really tricking myself here. I'm really in an illusion. There's like a tiny thing I can do right now instead of waiting for the perfect conditions. And then the other thing I want to say is in response to you talking about needing to hold everything together, because I think this is a really important sentence. So when I was a kid and a teenager, I would cry at the drop of a hat. I was crying all the time about anything and everything. If someone was angry, if someone was stressed, if I did the wrong thing, if I felt embarrassed, crying. And I remember my mom saying to me, Like, you really got to toughen up, because life is just going to be too hard for you if every small thing upsets you this much. And in some ways, I understand what she's saying. And in some ways, I even agree with her. But what she didn't know was that my body was taking all kinds of toxins and poisons and immediately shifting the stress chemicals into medicine, into literally painkillers. And it was clearing and soothing me. And it was only everybody else's panic and interpretation of about what was happening that was then causing me to freak out and feel like I shouldn't be doing it. And, because you have little kids,
Yeah.
they are done when they're done.
Yes.
They're in a new moment. And I
Totally.
think that we should not hold it together. I think actually holding it together too much is what creates cycles of intergenerational trauma,
Yeah.
because we can't give people what we've never received. We can't forgive things in others that we won't forgive ourselves for. We are walking around so wound up and under resourced when we don't grieve, cry, and release, that of course we're going to take it personally when someone cuts us off in traffic, or of course we're going to say something we don't mean to say when we're really tired. And so I feel like that natural ability to fall apart, to not hold it together, it is that reset, like you were talking about before with the grief.
Yeah.
It's like you're in a new life when you're finished that process.
Yeah. So much of what you reflected there. Thank you so much for reflecting all of that. I really connected with. In fact, I remember this one conflict or disagreement I had with my partner, and I was like speaking my truth because I can relate in that I cry at everything when I was a kid, and I still cry. I allow my tears to come even today, and I usually cry in every podcast episode, so I'm like surprised I haven't broken down. But I will say, every time we cry, it's literally our body's innate ability to release cortisol from our system. And that's why after a really big cry, you feel this sense of like, I could breathe. And in the conflict with my partner, I'm like speaking these truth bombs. I was on like day 2 of my bleed, which is never a time to argue with a woman. But I was like, I'm not uncomfortable with the way I feel. You are. And so like that's something worth naming. And like, I love that you said it wasn't like you were having your experience, yes, but it was everyone else's perspective of that experience that also brought an element to what was happening. And to circle back to my children, like one thing I'm in practice with them is like all feelings are welcome here, but not all behaviors. So
Yes.
there's going to be so much that comes up, and like they are my greatest teachers. And I have to remind myself too, like your body is so wise. Like in somatics, we learn this, and I've learned this through womb studies too. Like it will prioritize our survival over our thrival. So that which we take in through the world is shape shifting our experience of it. And that which we experience and how we project our experience out into world is also impacting, like collectively, all the people around us. And how when you think of like down to like the myelin and the connectivity in our body and all the little pathways, the neural pathways, it's like every part is applicable back to farming like the forest. So I just find that theme so beautiful. And I'm noticing now more than ever this powerful notion of like, it's not like, yes, you are having an individual experience, but I feel like I'm being open more and more now to like the deep connectivity through our individual experiences, especially like globally what's going on, and just like how I feel like there's so much helplessness that a lot of us feel, and like there are tiny but mighty ways through which we could choose to shift vibrationally, even if you think it's not. Like even a prayer is sending love and energy to the people that may not be able to access that in what they're moving through. It's just something I've been thinking about lately. So I wonder for you if that's come up in your experiences or the messages you get, and how you could amplify that feeling of like, yes, there is connection here, and yes, I matter, and yes, I can have a difference, even if it's not outwardly visible right away or ever at all.
Yeah. That's a really important, I think, thing for everyone to come to their own relationship with. For me, I think a lot about how, and this is probably one of the most repeated themes in my work since like 2017, is I think a lot about how the sign of Aquarius is representative of the collective, but also the rebel, as those things seem counter to each other. And like the forest, everything serves the whole by being what it is. And when we talk
Yes.
about collectivism and working towards the collective, because we live in a very mental plane, there is this sort of assumption that the way to guide and be with the collective is to adopt the same way of thinking or adopt the same principles. And that can definitely be helpful when you're creating community, to talk about and say out loud what the rules of the space are and make sure you're in values that are aligned. But in a much more metaphysical way, I feel like, there's this idea that, this is not an idea, it's the truth, that in every part of our body, the DNA of the whole rest of our body is present. So the whole story is in the micro. And I think that the universe is the same. So I sort of conceptualize it like this. If I haven't experienced it, I'm uploading it to the collective memory or the collective unconscious or the collective cloud. Maybe some people would think of this as like the Akashic records, so that it's there for everyone. And when something is happening to someone else out there in the world that's really harmful on some level, that's downloaded into me. And
Yeah.
so instead of thinking about how do I prioritize my own well being or the collective well being and sort of seeing them as these two opposing viewpoints, I just sort of see a spiral fractal of the whole inside each of us. And this allows me to be accountable for the fact that I am an embodied human who must take actions, but also open to the fact that my experience and belief system doesn't need to be the same or match what other people are expecting from me in order for me to contribute to the
Yeah.
whole.
I'm just really taking that in because what I've noticed on Instagram, for example, there are like super incredible activists. And then there are others like myself who I don't consider myself an activist, but I'm definitely human and I certainly have a broken heart over what's happening. And it's like, sometimes in my lowest points, I could think like, how do I like raise my voice in that sense? And so everything you just said is just feels really validating down to like what you said about our DNA having the whole in it. Makes me think of like, it might sound silly, but when I cut into an apple and I noticed like one apple I cut into once had so many seeds, and I was really blown away by like some human that I've never met like decades ago or 10 years, 8 to 10 years, I think it's what it takes for a apple tree to harvest, planted this. Now it's in my hand. It's going to nourish my babies. And then from what they do, that nourishment and what their bodies do, it will continue to reap this wave. And it just makes me think about like on a micro level, yes, my prayers might not be as outwardly as like what some activists is doing, and their work is also so powerful and impactful, but it does change my frequency, and that is impactful for my own family system in the land that that I'm living in and the space I'm living with my family. And I just think energetically like that is powerful. And I remember this quote that I read that's like, when you walk into a room, the first thing that introduces you isn't your physical presence, it's your energy. And I really feel that like I can relate to a lot of things on an energetic level, and the human part of me is like, I'm not doing enough,
Mm.
and yeah, it just, I think about that a lot. Like, how do we play our part? And also, how do we get out of the edge that we're leaned up against that's telling us that, the bigger thing that I want to do on a like a more outwardly scale, it's okay to do it. It's safe to do it. It's coming from a place like I can't physically see, but deeply I feel. So it must be connected with something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so beautiful what you shared about the apple. I feel like there is a lot of imagination actually missing in the opportunity just to think about how much has to happen for you to have anything that you have or any experience that you have. And I think that's why capitalism and convenience becomes harmful. Like on the real, I'm someone who really loves convenience in my life, but I don't like it at the expense of feeling like I will ever forget that somebody made this thing that I am
Yeah.
using, and there will be a consequence to how I use it. And I feel like what you're speaking to is this sticky place between the metaphysical understandings of the world from maybe your spiritual perspective or your soul's perspective, and then the rules of engagement when it comes to being in a human body where actions have to be taken, where resources are needed. And you just know that to be the case.
Right.
And I think that this took me a long time to wrestle with. Actually, I'm in the middle of this container, so it just keeps coming up. My wrestling with it ended up becoming my course because I had to walk myself through the questions of like, how do I know what's real? How do I know what's true? How do I know what comes from culture and what comes from me? How do I know if there's right and wrong? And if there isn't, then what else do I navigate by?
Yeah.
I had to kind of like break myself down and build myself up by asking really fundamental questions like, what is a human being? What is time? Like, what is sacred? All those things. And I think what really felt wrong to me in a lot of different activist spaces that I was in, because a lot of my friends are activists, and I certainly feel like I lean towards people who want to acknowledge all the horrors in the world that just don't have to be there, that don't have to be happening.
Yeah.
Is that I often felt, and some of this was my own thing that I was bringing into the space, but some of this was the space, is I often felt like I was not allowed to disagree or ask a question. And at
Mm.
the end of the day, what's really true for me is I cannot trust you if you will not allow me to ask a question, or if you feel like if I didn't read all the same books as you and I don't agree with everything that you're saying, points A through B, that makes me a bad person. Because
Yes.
on a fundamental level, that can't be true for me.
Mm.
That doesn't feel right for me. And so I had to learn my boundaries around how to interact in spaces that felt organic and like they were coming from my desire and resource to overflow towards people I can help, versus trying to make sure I didn't feel like a bad person. And actually, probably the most harmful things I have ever done in my life came from me acting from a place trying to protect myself from feeling like I might be a bad person,
Right.
because that was fear driven
Yes.
and it was dishonest because of that. And it wasn't that harmful, but it was just not really me. And
Yeah.
so I think why I'm saying all this is because I really relate to the experience you're having. A lot of people are afraid to talk about it
Yeah.
because we live in a very sort of extremist binary thinking polarity
Cancel
timeline
culture.
right
Yeah.
now. And I think there's a big difference between accountability and canceling people.
Mm.
And I think there's a big difference between having the same values as other people and needing everybody to be like you in order to work together.
Yeah, that's such a big one. And
Yeah.
you describe it so well, and thank you for sharing it in that way because it really helps me expand my perspective as to the experience I'm experiencing. And I'm just naming that you had 90 minutes and you said you had to go. So are you okay for like 5 more minutes?
Yeah,
Okay,
totally.
cool. I could talk to you forever. Yeah, so and I love how you mentioned how what I was questioning became the course, because what I'm noticing is a lot of the questions I have tend to lead to an inspirational path, because it's like if I'm questioning it, there's got to be other people wondering too that are curious or moving through this same sort of path or journey, this part in their journey. And one thing you mentioned when you were like, that would be coming from a fearful place, and that didn't feel like me. And one thing I've been receiving lately is like, in the field of wellness or spirituality or new age, I've noticed before language of like, love and light always, and like love and light is very real and it's very important, and it is, I believe, our innate being. And I've noticed like in that there tends to be like, how do I word this? It's like take away everything that isn't it. But the thing is, taking away everything that isn't it sort of eradicates a giant part of the human experience. And so I find there tends to be like a seek and destroy charge behind that. Like, ooh, don't go in that area because it's bad or whatever, or like it's toxic, XYZ. And one thing that I've been receiving lately in the approach to how I receive, because there is some truth to a lot of it, and there's some truth that doesn't. There's some of it that also doesn't resonate for me. But what I'm feeling in my work is how do I bring more of not a seek and destroy, but awareness and expansion to reconnect and remember people with that which feels so alive in them. And one of my first guests, her name was Tahiti Kulia. She's a beautiful soul from
I love Tahiti.
yeah, she's such a beautiful soul, and she really speaks to this, and just bringing that awareness and expansion, and how you can, like, in our conversation, she's like, sometimes that's like in the frequency of like folding napkins because I'm changing the frequency of this mess or whatever, and I just think that is a really like, I feel like as humans we really overthink things, and that takes us far beyond what is available to us right now. We end up missing the life that is really quite literally happening in front of us, where God, source, universe, love, whatever you want to call it, is like, I'm here, open arms, I never leave you. And yet, choosing to not view life through that lens is also a choice. And I know some people aren't able to make that choice. But and then another thing you said too is like, I had to ask fundamental questions like, what is a human? What is true? And what I was feeling before you even said that was like, oh, I know something I really want to ask her, as something to sort of tie this all together. And it's, what is most true for you right now? What feels most alive and true for you? And that's something Tahiti loves to talk about too. Like, what is alive for you right now? Because I feel like we often disregard that, or we think that what's alive is not enough to be alive for this
Mm,
part of our life or our world or our social culture. But yet it's alive in you, so it matters. So what is true
yeah.
and alive for you?
You know, I was thinking about this when you were just describing the experience of love and light. And what is true for me is that I have yet to figure out a way. I'm a really logical person in a lot of ways. I'm a very scientific person, but I'm also like deeply creative. And when I come back to this same question over and over and over again, it helps me, which is like, what did the divine not make? Like when I'm looking at someone screaming at me because they're tired and they're in a rush and we're both running on the subway and they're yelling at me, I'm like, that's a form of the divine. Okay. When I'm interacting with the most silly thing and it's making me laugh, I'm like, that's a form of the divine. Okay. And I realize that for me, everything is the divine interacting with itself to learn about itself and to create more versions of itself, and to ultimately remember that it's all connected, but that it differentiates for a purpose, for a reason of learning. And so that thought always brings me back into who I am. And it's really simple and it's available all the time.
I love that. I feel like it offers such simplicity, and it feels also very digestible for everyone to connect with. I can't speak for everyone, but I felt that. So thank you. As we wrap up, I would love to know how people could find you. And of course, if there's anything else that is in your heart that you want to share right now, I welcome that so much.
Okay, so I am very active on social media, as you know. My handle is at Myths of Creation. That's also my website, mythsofcreation.com. And I have a Substack as well that's called Garden of the Imaginal.
It's really good,
And
by the way.
I have I am cooking up quite a lot of surprises for 2025, so you want to be on the newsletter to see what's going to happen. But I think the last thing I'll share is that I feel like if we could really make time in our lives to find points of joy and wonder, that we could easily see that life is full of potential and possibility. And when I turn to nature and when I turn to learning little facts about deep sea fish that glow in the dark and stars that are born out of black holes and comets that visit our solar system once every 80,000 years, it makes me feel like I have to be magic because everything else is. How could that not be true? It's self
Mm.
centered to think I'm the only thing that's not magic. Um, if we could just allow ourselves to see like a kid, we could love like a kid.
Mm.
And the world would be a very different place if we felt safe to do that.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful note to end on. Thank you, Xenia, so much for being here. I really, really enjoyed our conversation, and I look
Thank
forward
you
to
so
staying
much.
staying connected through your work. I know you mentioned your Substack earlier, but I just want to say everybody that they're just as animated as her posts, and they're so fun to read. So thank you again, Xenia, for everything you do and
Thank you
everything
for
you do.
having me.
Yeah. Okay.